And we're live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of WunderGraph AMA, where you join us and we ask questions and we bring on special guests. And today we have a very special guest, Matt Biilmann, CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Hey, Matt, how you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me here. Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, I'm joined by my co-founder and CEO of WunderGraph. Hey, Jens, how you doing today?
Hi, Stefan.
Long time no see, right?
I feel a bit like, you have these American late night shows, and there's this one show host, and there's this other guy in the corner. I feel like this other guy.
That's very nice of you to say, though. So I guess I'm Jimmy Fallon. I actually don't watch those, but I'll take the compliment. But
Yeah.
no, you're actually a very important part of the AMA. So don't
Yeah,
feel like that.
thank you.
But cool, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. So today, as always, very relaxed. We have some questions that we're going to start with asking you. And I think the first question I would love to get into is your founding journey in Netlify. So when was the first time the idea struck? When did you get the idea for Netlify? And what was the journey going from 0 to 200 million in funding to where you guys are now?
Well, I mean that's a lot. It's been a long journey, right? Like and started in many ways a long time ago. I've been professionally. I've been working on building tools for developers for very long, right? Like I was CTO of a company in Spain. That as a company built websites for small to medium businesses around Europe, but at a very high scale, right? Like, so we were building around 100 websites a week, tens of thousands of sites. And I ran the product and engineering org that actually built the platform that the designers would do the design with, that the clients would use for content management, and that powered every single project from initial brief and all the way to production hosting. So that was like very fundamental in getting a lot of experience in like how all of those workflows work and how you scale that and how you get to service both developers and designers and end users and so on, and how you build like the kind of infrastructure that can run and operate reliably that level of load, right? So I started initially a startup in Spain together with the founder of that company, where we would take like the learnings from building that kind of platform in-house and then build a cloud-hosted CMS, a multi-tenant cloud-hosted CMS, and take a lot of the same benefits to all of our, like, to other professionals, other agencies and so on. I came to the Bay Area working on that. And it had like a very strict, like one of the things I learned was to build like a very strict separation between the whole design and development layer and then the actual content and content structure layer. And Webpub, as it was called, had that built in, but it was still one monolithic application. And around the time I started seeing sort of the first, at the time, Contentful started coming out, there was a couple of other players like Prismic or Smig was a tool back then, right? Like that was starting this idea of headless content. And I could really see the potential of that, this idea of like, okay, if we are already sort of building a separation, why not make it more fundamental and have a completely different app for that? But I was thinking a lot about what happens to the other piece of it, right? Like, because we were starting to have these first companies coming out and building headless APIs, but there was not really anything built for the head, so to speak, right? Like, what should you actually do with that? And that I would say became like the real start of what became Netlify, right? Like really thinking, if I want to service that layer on its own, how does it look like? How do we do that best in class? And what benefits, how can we change the whole workflow around working on the web experience layer if it's not tied to all the things that can make it move slower when you also have the whole backend business logic layer sort of rolled into it? So I built first a small MVP in that space called BitBalloon, and just focused on like, what's the first thing I can do that really gives a sense of the impact of this separation. And that was just this idea of like, what if you could just drag a folder with your front end onto bitballoon.com and instantly it's online, it's fast, it's robust, it's scalable, right? Like, because we give you that sense of like, there's something here that you can just do much easier than we could ever do before. And then I started like building on that, so I'd get traction with the right kind of developers, added CLI and API layer, and started talking to one of my best friends back in Denmark, Chris, who ended up joining as my co-founder, right? Like, and started really talking through this idea of a different architecture for the web and what it would mean. And we started really talking through, okay, from the whole, he had been building his own first production company and then sold it to a full service agency where he was chief digital officer and so on, right? Like, so he brought a lot of experience of working with big brands, large corporate clients, and seeing what they needed. And from our shared experience, we sort of really came up with the initial roadmap for Netlify in the sense of like, we believe this architectural shift has a ton of benefits and will be much better. It will be a big step forward for the web. But we need to provide a lot of tooling to reduce the friction in adopting that architecture, right? Like, and build the first roadmap for Netlify, launched it as a bootstrapped company at first in a show Hacker News in the start of 2015. And then got a lot of organic traction from that and started getting a lot of real customers on board. So by the end of 2015, we were still just 2 people bootstrapping, but we were serving around 250 million web requests a month for companies like Sequoia Capital and WeWork and the Malala Foundation and Greenpeace and so on, right? Like, so very obvious that there was something there, and that became then the start of our first Series C fundraise that involved a lot of like one of the things we're fortunate there was that we got a lot of other founders and so on in the space on board as angels, people like Tom that founded GitHub, the founders of Heroku, one of the founders of Rackspace Cloud, and so on, right? Like, that really that were really great to have on board in sort of the shared experience and so on. And then Bloomberg Beta and back then they were called Tank Hill Ventures. Today they called Ad.Inc. Joined as like the main VCs in the round. Hired the first employees in March 2016. Wow. And then started like on the full sort of venture-backed track with almost like with a cadence of rounds following that. Series A with Andreessen, Series B with Kleiner Perkins, Series C later with EQT and Menlo Ventures, and latest our Series D with Bessemer and Bond. And by now, obviously, like very, very different situation. Back then, we had to invent a whole category in a way, right? Like, because this architecture was not something people, like, we believed in it, but it wasn't something that even had a name, right? Like, we had to come up with the name Jamstack to give sort of a way to even talk about this, right? Like, today, obviously, we've onboarded 4 million developers to our platform. We are serving some of the largest brands in the world. December alone, we served more than 10 petabytes of data out of our global network. It's a very different scale, and we are now in this next stage of the journey where we've gone from like early adopters coming to this, the kind of technologists that are always looking for like new technology to learn and to boost their efforts and so on, and are experimenting a lot and moving from stack to stack. And now we're sort of really moving into what you can call the early majority, right? Like, that's a more pragmatic segment of typically large businesses where the developers there are fundamentally like concerned about solving business problems and moving business objectives forward. And now they're at a point where they can see that this stack has done this for other companies, and they need to get on board.
Wow, what a history. I have so many follow-up questions, but I'm going to let Jens go first.
I have one too. So you said you were 2 guys working on this, no funding yet, and you were already able to get big named customers using your software.
Yeah.
How were you able to, like,
I mean,
did they
I
ask you how many people you are, or how were you able to
no, I feel
convince them that you're actually able to provide a good service?
yeah, I to be honest, it's a good question. I don't think they realized we were two guys, and especially that there was one guy doing all the technology at the time. So we did we did seem like we were more, also because obviously we work with some contractors for design and writing and so on, right? Like so we managed to sort of cast a bigger shadow than what we were. We worked with a lot of with building relationships to agencies and so on that work directly with these clients, and just put in a ton of effort to also keep the trust people put in us when they were there, right? Like answering any support ticket that came in instantly. I sometimes didn't sleep a lot of night from just having, like, I was the one on-call person maintaining all of that, right? Like, it also came down to like building a reliable service from the beginning, right? Like, I put a lot of thought into how to make the software I was building simple enough that I could operate it at scale as one person. Build a lot of automation around that to make it relatively smooth, and but also constantly just thought of like simplicity in the system to make it like viable for me to operate at that scale. And then again, just like in the early days, there was a lot of hustle. Like, we sold some of the larger ones technically got a dedicated account manager as part of their package, right? Like, and there was me and Chris, so we were kind of like running out of voices to make when someone asked for that dedicated account manager. Oh yeah, I'll pass you to
Hey, Matt, can you bring Matthias?
yes.
I mean, I love that though. That's the real founder's journey. And so early on, were you guys focusing, because you guys launched on Hacker News and you guys were getting huge developer traction, were you focusing more on the community, or were you focusing more on these enterprise customers coming in, like as you were saying with the support?
Oh, it was completely bottom up, right? Like, so we were completely focused on the developer profile and the community and getting in that way, right? Like, and when we got into these larger customers, it was either through developers or through the developers as agencies that they worked with, right? Like, so it was very, very bottom up developer focused, and we did. Early on, for example, we hired a freelance designer back in Denmark that Chris had worked with to give us sort of a more corporate looking website as we launched early, with like somewhat more corporate messaging, right? Like, we wanted to make sure that the feel there was not of like, there's a certain quirkiness and so on that often you actually want when you're going after the developer audience, that we did say that when we were just two people and so on, we couldn't afford that in terms of the enterprise customers. So when we were just two people, we actually kept, like, at that point, we actually built a fairly boring corporate website and then engaged with developers on Hacker News and Twitter, and did our series of meetups, and they had other resources like staticgen.org and things like that was sort of really oriented in that direction, but kept our sort of profile, like, trying to make it feel safe for a larger company. And then I think once we got more traction and we had a real team and a validation, like especially after a Series A from Andreessen and so on, then there was a period where we could go more loose with like more pure developer branding and so on. And now we're probably again like in a different mixture, right? Like, where now it's like higher production quality and more of a message that also has to resonate with a with a corporate buyer and so on, right? Like, so you always swing a bit back and forth between all of those. But in the beginning, it was community and developer and bottom up adoption. Like that was all we focused on.
Love that. And Jens, does that sound a little bit familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to hear how you think about, did the market change in the last years, like from where you started and how it's now, and how would you tackle the problem of building a bottom-up motion? Would you tackle it differently today, or how do you see the change in market condition? I personally would say these days it became a lot noisier and much harder to actually get noticed. But I'm curious to how you see it and what your suggestions are. I'm pretty sure we have a lot of startups who follow us and who are also looking at how they can build a bottom-up motion. And yeah.
I mean, there's always a lot of market cycles, right? Like the actual predecessor to Netlify and BitBalloon, the CMS I started like in the January 2010, right after like the massive 2008 2009 crash, right? Like, which was very rough down cycles that I experienced very directly in Spain, where it was even rougher, right? Like Spain at the time reached like 50% youth unemployment and 25% unemployment in general, right? Like, then we raised our funding sort of in the end of 2015, got it closed in 2016, and that was sort of a start of obviously like a big sort of overheating of the market in many ways, and now we are obviously in a new correction where since last year the market environment has changed a lot. Interest rates have gone up a lot. Funding availability is very different from a peak of that period where some founders got like term sheets in their inbox without even meeting investors to a world that's just not like that anymore, right? Like, and where it's a lot more back to fundamentals. All of those periods will like always comes and goes. The truth is, I never think they influence like the early stages of building a company as much as the later ones, because the early stage, no matter what, is always just really, really hard. and there's no sort of real shortcuts. Getting bottom up adoption in any period is really hard, right? Like there's this phrase from what's he called, Steve Blank, from his book, The Startup Owner's Manual, where he describes like the biggest challenge you're facing initially as a startup is the wall of indifference of the market. And I've always liked that phrase, right? Like, because it's just this phase that you care so much, right? Like, you're building something, you know why it's important, you care so much, but breaking through that wall of indifference where you actually get someone outside of your company to really care is really hard, and has always been, right? Like, and it's one of the hardest, like, I think I saw some good tweets from you, Jens, also on sort of realizing I've very much been on the same journey initially, right? Like, you have this tendency as a technologist to focus on features, and you're hoping like, if I just build the next feature, people will care, right? Like, and at some point you have to realize that just doesn't work like that. It's a different problem you have to solve, the indifference problem, right? And the key to building a real bottom-up engine is solving the indifference problem, right? Like, it's figuring out why should people care. And often you have to find a story that resonates and puts you aside from anyone else that you can drive, right? Like, and for us, this was the Jamstack story, even before we called it Jamstack, right? Like, but it was this sense that, okay, there's gonna be an architectural shift happening, right? Like, fundamental change in how people build for the web. And if we write about that, then a bunch of things are going to be important and going to be relevant. And if we're wrong about that, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, so let's just bet on that, and let's start really figuring out, okay, if we're right about that, what kind of information will people need to find? What kind of resources will need to exist, and so on. We started building up these things like staticgen.org with like the list of all the static site generators, and headlesscms.org with like rankings and list of all the headless content platforms and so on, right? Like, and we started early on at a static web tech meetup, right? Like, and again, the first edition was at our dog patch office. It was I was giving a talk. My co-founder was there. Then one of our early collaborators or competitors were there, and then two people that came obviously for the pizza. That was like the audience, right? Like, but we still like put up a staticwebtech.com website, published the video from the talk, and started like tweeting that and so on, right? Like, just starting building all of these resources, and then at a point introduced Jamstack and so on, right? Like, so you have to find some story arc that resonates and sets you apart, and you can build strategy around for all content you put out, for everything you do, and really figure out how that can help you break through that wall of indifference and be relevant to a bigger market segment that you could be if you're just your product, right?
That's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of wisdom there, and I just think the entire journey it's quite amazing. But when you said 2015, I wanted to say something. So in 2015, I graduated high school. It was when you were starting out the college, and then 4 years later, I graduated college, and my first job, I had to do a little demo project, and I think the time continuum or something is so crazy because I hosted my first website for my first job as an engineer on Netlify. And then now today, here I am with my co-founder and with you on a stream. So I think it's beautiful full circle. And before Jens says it, I'm not an engineer anymore, but I was at one time, Jens. I knew he was waiting for it because I was probably the worst engineer. But I mean, it's amazing that you made that possible. And just like that story really resonates really well with us, how, like you said, two people came at first and they were there for the pizza. And then now look at this.
Yeah.
I mean,
and
amazing.
what I would like to add here is we should never forget that probably every success story, and we can definitely say Netlify is a success story. Every such story, it didn't begin like a big, huge success. There was a hustle. There was, I don't know, it just didn't work overnight. And I think it's great you share this, and yeah, that this can also empower founders who might currently be stuck, or they just experienced the situation where they launched something, or they had an event, nobody came, and yeah.
I think that's really important to remember, right? Like, from the outside, you always have an interest in projecting everything as this like amazing upward trajectory where everything is great and it's a rocket ship. From the inside, every founder I've known that's been successful in building something like this or getting this level of traction, raising this amount of funding, there's just been like an incredibly long, tough grind behind it that, to be honest, never really stops. But especially typically those first learnings and that first cycle to really go from like being a couple of co-founders with some product and an idea to actually getting traction. Of course, there's always exceptions to anything, right? Like some people win the lottery every month. It does happen, right? Like, but the typical case is that it's like 5-10 years of grind before that sort of take off moment actually arrives.
What I'm curious about is, so we're slowly moving towards Series A.
Yeah.
And I came to realize that seeds is kind of like, hey, we have an idea. Do you want to fund us? Oh yeah, this looks cool. Let's try it out. Here's some money, and you go try it out. But Series A is serious. Like, the game changes. What are your suggestions to actually make that transition and not get stuck, or like, how do you have to change as a company? How do you have to progress, and what did you learn that can actually make the transition work from the seed stage to I would say a real company that is ready for a Series A?
I mean, I would say Series A is still early stage, right? Like Series A is still Series Seed and Series A. Like there's this progression of the stages, right? Like, and today people introduce a lot of extra stages sometimes, like pre-seeds and and whatever, right? Like, but in general, from all the way up to a Series A, you're generally still talking about investors taking sort of a bet on wildly unproven, on something wildly unproven that needs to be worth a lot, right? Like, so sometimes one thing that I think can be bad advice to founders is like, there can be a lot of focus on like, for Series A, you need this amount of revenue, something like that. Back when we were raising, a lot of people were saying, for Series A, you need to get to at least 1 million AR. That'll be really important, right? Like, and that was sort of like what circulated, right? Like, and we didn't have 1 million AR when we raised our Series A, but we got 6 term sheets in 4 days from the biggest fund in the Bay Area, right? Like, because in the end, like, what you need at Series A is a very big story. You have to be able to tell a convincing story around how the market you're in is going to be really big, and how the potential of what you're building can capture a big enough piece of that market to make a company worth billions of dollars, right? Like, no great Series A investor will be interested at all unless they believe that story, right? Like, because that's what they need to get a return of their investment, right? Like, and whether you have like 20K, 500K, 1 million, or 2 million, in itself, that doesn't really bring you further or closer to being worth multiple billions of dollars, right? Like, you can very easily have a $20 million run rate company that's never going to be worth $1 billion. Like, that's lots of those good, solid companies out there, but they're just not in a big enough market. They're into tougher space and so on, that they might be worth $200 million, but they'll never have a path to being worth billions of dollars, right? Like, so when you're out raising a Series A, you have to have a really like a convincing narrative around how could your company be one of those companies that are worth billions of dollars. So that's the first piece. You need that narrative, right? Like, and obviously, again, it's a Series A, it's early enough that no matter what you have in traction and revenue and so on, it's not like it's a guarantee or anything like that, right? Like, they're taking a wild bet, but if there's no potential massive outcome, no one is going to take the bet, right? Like, so the first piece is really figuring out that story. Then the next piece is that you have to somehow anchor that story in reality. And that's where your current traction, your current customers, your current revenue, whatever you've done so far, needs to actually be a proof point towards like, you can be the ones to do that. For us, that was a lot about pure developer traction at that stage, right? Like, it was about the chart of organic signups just coming in, coupled with some key real world projects that showed that this could have an impact, coupled with like Smashing Magazine at the time, like doing their big re-platforming to Netlify and posting about it and so on, right? Like, so for us, the big story was, right, like, there's gonna be a fundamental architectural shift in the web, And long term, essentially all companies out there is going to re-platform to this way of building, right? Like, that's like every VC that understands the web understands that that's a really, really big market. And if you can build a really important space in that like a really important company in that transformation, you can build a very, very big company, and you can take it very fast. And then we tied it back to reality with very real traction numbers of like just an exponential growth in developers coming, signing up, building stuff, with huge social media traction. We were all over Twitter and Hacker News and so on, with developers that genuinely loved our product, right? Like we had, like as an appendix to our Series A deck, just like pages of tweets and support messages of customer love. And then with some real world example of actual businesses starting to adopt this, from like early adopters like Smashing Magazine, but also like some of the early real world customers we had, right? Like, and I think for Series A, that is kind of the two important things for an ideal Series A, right? Like, and then again, just remember that all of these founder journeys are different, right? Like some people suddenly get a Series A and everything goes well. Some founders are out there getting rejected 60 times until suddenly someone takes a bit of them and it works out and they go build $1 billion company, right? Like every journey is different. There's a lot of survivorship bias in any advice you're getting, including advice from me. It's a lot of luck and timing involved and so on. But I think, to me, that's still the core of it for Series A. You have to be able to convincingly to yourself, tell a story of how what you're building becomes a very big multi-billion-dollar company. Typically, for you to tell that story, that needs to be related to some bigger market change that you are part of. Otherwise, it's just hard to argue that something that's small now will get that big in the future. And then you have to anchor it in reality with some demonstration of what you're currently doing really working.
I love that. And I can see Jens, the gears are turning in his head when he's looking away like that, because this is exactly what we're doing as we go for a Series A pitch, the vision, the storytelling, but also we're very anchored in the reality of like what's going on with the market conditions. But great feedback.
Yeah, like a couple of days ago, I did a podcast with a VC about fundraising Series A, or early stage in general. And the thing Jens is German. Okay, David is trying to derail me again. Anyway, so we were doing this podcast, and I don't know. Over time, I came to realize that when you're not a founder, and you keep hearing about companies who do fundraising and who got fundraising, you keep hearing these news about here's their pitch deck, and the thing is that I don't know. At the beginning, like when I wasn't a founder, I was always thinking like, okay, I need a very good pitch deck, and in reality, what you actually need is, like, I agree with the part where you say you need this good story, but I think most importantly, you actually need to have the proof. Like, if you don't have something to back up your story,
yeah,
it's just nonsense. So also, I don't know how you think about it, but how important is actually a good pitch deck when you have a good story and when you have good numbers?
I mean, it's the least important piece, right? Like by far the most, like the Series A was the only fundraising series we've raised where I would say the pitch deck played a role, honestly, right? Like we had an okay pitch deck there, right? Like that we used, but even then we only used the pitch deck towards the end of the fundraise, not at the beginning, right? Like, but it was a pretty good deck. In the seed round, we had a pitch deck, wasn't great, and none of the investors that invested, I think, got a presentation of the pitch deck. It was all about talking through it. And after the Series A, it's all been essentially like preemptive, informal processes without a real pitch deck, right? So I totally agree. Like there is, and I've been there as well, right? Like before I went through all of this, right? Like you see these pitch decks and people are sharing, this deck helped company X raise $100 million and so on, right? Like, and as you go through this journey, you realize that, yeah, like the deck is really it's all about, especially the later stage you go, it's all about actually having built a great company that's a good investment, right? Like, I mean, that would be my core advice. If you want to get investment, then make sure you're a good investment, right? Like, because really great investors are constantly out there trying to find the good investments. And once a company is really obviously a good investment, they will get a lot of term sheets, just like from really smart investors that can figure out this is a good investment, right? Like, so always focus on making your company a great investment first, right? Like, but then it is also true that especially in the seed and A stages, in the early stages, it's still so hard to know what's a good investment and that's what's not a good investment, that you also need to combine it with the ability to tell that story. And I would also say that it's rare that you have a set of founders that can take a company all the way to a multi-billion-dollar company, but that can't also tell a convincing story about why their company, like, I mean, selling and marketing and taking your product to market is such a big part of building a company, that if you have something great, but you're really not able to put that into a deck and articulate it and so on, then you might not be a good investment, right? Like, so I think there's more of that proof point, but I totally agree. There's like this over-indexing on like, here's the pitch deck that raised, and it's never the pitch deck that raises anything. It's the founders that raise it, and it's the metrics that raise it, and it's the story and the company and the people that raise it.
I love that. And I like this quote from Alberto: 1, be attractive, and 2, don't be unattractive. Both for Tinder and startups. It is true though. And then Mish is asking a question. Hey Jens, did VCs ever reject you because you were too similar to our portfolio companies? And I think Matt, you can also talk about this as well. Go ahead, Jens.
Yeah, multiple times. Sometimes it's a bit weird. Sometimes I feel really sorry for them because they're betting on a dead horse. But yeah, it happened a lot. And I think it maybe you have some advice on this, Matt, but sometimes when you do something highly technical like WunderGraph, like we're unifying APIs and stuff, it is not always super simple to tell that story, and not everybody immediately gets that. But I guess the fault is on myself in this case, because I'm not good enough at telling that story, right?
I mean, I think it's just also important to understand that as for VC, you can't, like, imagine that you had a VC that invested in WunderGraph, that took a bet on you, that took a board seat, and then they went and did the same with one of your competitors, and suddenly you had like a board member sitting both on your board seat and on your competitor's board seat, right? Like, you would feel deeply uncomfortable. Like, that's not acceptable, right? Like, that's not okay behavior for VC, right? Like, so once someone takes an investment in you, they are also saying, you are our bet. We're not gonna go like take another bit. This is different from like the really early stage, right? Like incubators like Y Combinator, like angel investors and so on. They will spread their investments all over, right? Like, because they don't play in it as big a role. But when you're talking Series A, you're talking a partner that's coming in and like owning more than 20% of your company, right? Like, it's a really big stakeholder in your company, and that's a commitment they make to you. That also means they can't go and also own 20% of one of your competitors. That would just be a big conflict of interest, right? Like, but that also means that from when you think about it from the investor's perspective, that means that when a new category is forming, a new set of companies is coming along and so on. Like a really hard part of the Series A investment, especially for a big fund, is not the money. Like if you have Andreessen or a Sequoia or like any of these really big funds, right? Like look at how many billions they have under management, right? The $12 million or whatever, or 10, 20 that they put into a Series A company, it's actually not a very big amount of money for them. But it's a very big commitment in terms of future strategy. If they see, hey, if you're saying there's big change happening in the market and it's going to mean X, Y, Z, you're one of the companies that are going to drive it. Well, then it also means that there's probably going to be, let's say they really believe your story there, right? Then they're going to think, okay, there's going to be 1 or 2, maybe 3 winners in that category. And everyone else in that category is going to be irrelevant. So now the big question is not really like the money and the investment. It's like, who do we take a bet on, right? Like, because once they take that bet, they've sort of like, that's their bet in that cluster of companies, right? Like suddenly with this change in front end, right? Like you would suddenly see a whole new generation of CMSs come out, all headless CMSs, right? Like every investor that goes and talks to them is trying to figure out which of them can I take a bet on, because the moment I decide, I can't go in the Series B or in the Series C or in the Series D later in the one that wins, right? Like some of them might say, I simply don't know. I prefer to sit it out and wait till I can put a bigger check into a Series C or a Series D when the market has sort of sorted out who are the winners, right? Like same if it's like, hey, all these new serverless databases coming out, right? Like every investor in like a Series A or B will be like, once I choose, I've made my choice. And if they feel that they still quite haven't figured out who's going to win, they might just say, I'm not ready to make that bet, and I prefer to sit out this round and make the market choose and then try to get in later on when it's clear to me where the winner is. So that's a very real phenomenon.
I think this is brilliant advice, because as a founder, you can actually work backwards from that. So if you understand, okay, the founders, they build a thesis for every category, and they can only make that one bet in this category. And that essentially means it's either this round, or if they cannot decide what company to bet on in this category, they defer that further. And yeah, I think it can help a founder to understand this process and see, okay, who am I against up, and what are the what are the things how I can stand out in that. One thing we keep touching on, and I'm curious on your take here, is focus, because we keep using the word competitors, and we keep hearing the word customers or users, something that SST would love to have, for example. What should you be focusing on? How much should you be focusing on your competition? And how does this change in the life cycle, or does it change in the life cycle of a company? Because I couldn't care less about, like early stage, I couldn't care less about competition. I really just focus on our users and expanding that motion and doubling down on that. But I guess maybe at a later stage it becomes more important to be on par, or I don't know. I'd love to hear.
In the end, I think you can never focus too much on your users and your customers, right? Like that's especially when you're building product, that's what you need to build, right? Like you need to listen to them and understand them. And sometimes they will lead you to competitors. They'll say, I need this thing that competitor XYZ has, and so on. And you have to figure out, does that mean we have to build the same thing, or do we have to solve the problem in a different way? But you should always, like, in terms of building your product, it's always listening to the customers. It's never just looking to the competitors, right? Like it should always be the customers you look at. But then, of course, in terms of building your strategy and your narrative, you need to look at the competitive space you're in, right? Like, and you have to figure out your strategy there, right? Like, are you gonna just accept that there's a market with multiple companies doing very similar things and you're one of them and you're just going to be better at doing it for your customers? Are you going to attack a specific segment of customers in that market? Are you going to expand your product in a direction that's different from what competitors is doing, so long term there's a differentiation and so on, right? Like, so from a strategic perspective, you need to understand what are the players around you in the market, what are they doing, where are they going, where's the biggest space for you to attack, where you have little competition, and where's the space where you might need to focus on like feature parity with a competitor or whatever, right? Like, but in building the product, you should just focus on customers.
I love that. So Dax, if you're listening, stop focusing on us, you know, always in our stream, hanging out with us. Not kidding. So Dax is our friend from SST, which is, it's quite a fascinating product, and the company is really cool, and we always have good banter with them.
We don't know what it does, but we really love Dax, so we keep making jokes about him because that's his channel of traffic.
And
so
also,
yeah,
sometimes there's also a part where you should understand where the interests of you and your competitors intersect, especially if you're in an emerging category, right? Like, there's often a case where your biggest real competitor as a startup is the status quo. Is companies just still doing things in the way they're doing, and your biggest competitor is just that, and you're there trying to build a wave of change, right? Like, if that's the case, then it's the shared interest of you and your competitors of figuring out how do we make that wave of change happen, because like without that wave of change, the market is too small for any of us, right? Like, so where is the intersection, right? Like, where's the piece where we should actually be sponsoring the same conferences and telling the same stories and telling the same narrative and so on? Because like, if any of us wants a big market to exist, there's a lot more chance of that happening if we're if we're telling the same change story to the market, right? Like, so sometimes you should also really remember that, like, as those things shape up, competitors is not just a bad thing. They're also a pretty important thing, because like in the end, imagine you're like 10 years into a company journey and there's still not a single competitor. Well, that's probably because you're building something really irrelevant with a very small market. Like, if no one wants to come like try to take some of the chunk of the market you're in, then something is off, right? Like, so especially in that early stage of like building category and so on, you should also figure out like where's the shared interest, right? Like, where's the companies that might be competing with you but also need to collaborate with you in creating the market change you're all going after.
I love that.
I 100% agree. Sorry, Stefan, because our biggest competitor is developers who think what we've built in 2 years with many companies together, with all this experience, with all this iteration, and with hundreds of releases on NPM, developers keep thinking they can do the same thing in a week or so, or maybe 2 weeks. But no, they cannot even do it in 8 weeks. And you know, this keeps reminding me of one of my biggest career mistakes. I was a senior architect and we were building a website, and I didn't stop the decision that was made to run our own Kubernetes cluster. And by that, I mean run Kubernetes on bare metal services, because we were so naive and we thought we can pull it off, and we thought it makes sense for the business, and it didn't make sense. And I learned from that, and now I focus more on what matters to the business. But for WunderGraph, I can really say the biggest competitor is the developer who thinks, yeah, that's super easy. And I think that's one of our faults. We make it look too easy. Like, I don't know, the way we structure the config and the way you can do things, it looks so easy. And I don't know, maybe you have similar experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's very typical for all developer tools companies. In the end, like, especially if we're building the bottom up motion, we have to make what we do feel incredibly simple and easy, right? Like, and then it can be hard to then remind people, hey, just remember how hard it actually is, how much stuff is going on behind the scenes, right? Like, there's two stories here. One is my favorite, sort of one of my favorite stories from a customer that came to me at one of our early Jamstack conference and said, hey, I'm a front-end developer, and I'm like, from this company that's one of our enterprise customers, right? Like, I was the one that made us a customer of Netlify, and we had this new project coming up, and I told the team, look, Netlify will be like awesome to build this with. Like, they do the whole CI/CD pipeline, CDN setup, a workflow around it, and I could get it set up in like 30 seconds and we'll get going. And the DevOps team was like, yeah, I think we can build something internally in like a day that will do it. And he said, that's awesome. I just start on Netlify because it takes me 30 seconds. And then when you build the other one, we can migrate there. And he spun it up and got going. They never delivered on anything else. So they're still in Netlify today, right? Like, I love that story. I think it's very typical from a lot of cases. Then the other thing that this reminded me of is probably one of my favorite pieces of content marketing in this space ever, which was from MailChimp. That really specialized in making it seem incredibly easy to just set up mailing lists of customers and send mass mailings to them from a simple interface, right? And one of the brilliant things they did early on was publishing the ebook, which was like the system administrator's guide to hosting your own email service. And it was good, right? Like, it was probably like the best in class book about how to do the whole thing involved in running email infrastructure, setting up like postfix mailing servers, operating them, like scaling the clusters, backup technologies for all of that, and so on. And then spam compliance, registering with all the different places, maintaining like the reputation of your IPs and so on, right? Like, and at the same time, there's no doubt that anyone that starts reading that like 300-page book about everything you need to do, from that they've just downloaded from a place that also gives you like a $49 price point that you can get started with, right? Like,
yeah,
no one sane, as they're like 100 pages into that, will be like, yeah, I should totally do all of these things and keep doing it for infinity, versus just putting in my credit card here and it's done by the experts that wrote the book, right? Like, so that was just one of my favorite pieces of content marketing in this space ever, because it just tackled that problem so efficiently of like, what is it actually like? Here's how you go do it yourself, right? Like, and when you really realize what it takes to do it yourself, you realize how many edge cases there are, how hard it is, how much maintenance it's going to cost you, and how many mistakes you're going to make along the road, right? Like, and that's why we go by for it.
I have a surprise for you, because I'm currently writing the book, or let's just say it's a website, but I'm currently writing the book on building your own GraphQL API gateway. And it's going to be of infinite length, because it's five years of experience on building API gateways, and you will realize you actually never want to write your own.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
I love that. And guys, just to be conscious, so we're at the 5-minute mark. Matt, is it okay if we go 5 more minutes, so 10 minutes in total, because we have some questions?
Yeah, I can go a little over, not a lot. I can go like 5 minutes over, and then I have to.
Okay, cool. We want to be conscious of time, but so I've started some questions, and one of them was one of my questions I want to ask. So the future of Netlify, and this comes with Dax's question: how much do you want for Ryan Carniano?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, he is a free human being. So in the end, you would have to ask him. It's not like I own him or anything. I don't think he's missing, and I can say that all the prototypes and hobby projects I do, they are always in solid JS. I'm very fond of like the simple set of primitives it provides and the thinking behind it. What was the other question?
Love that. Next one by Mish. I have a technical question. This one might be, we can also talk about Valhalla and WunderGraph, but what is the value prop of Valhalla, WunderGraph, TakeShip, etc. when React server components exist? So whichever one of you guys wants to take this first. Matt, go ahead.
I mean, I can say like Valhalla, as it's codenamed currently. Stay tuned for more of a product announcement here in June. The existence or not of React server components, of basically any other front-end technology, has I would say have nothing to do with what that's offering. Like what we've learned as we've seen that this will even tie a bit into the future of Netlify, right? Like what we've seen, I talked about going from the early adopter segment and to the like early majority segment, right? Like where we are very much going from a world where most of our customers were either they were very tech forward companies, often relatively new, like generally speaking, right? Like the age of a Netlify or something like that, or just very tech forward, right? Like Silicon Valley startups at any stage and so on, right? Like that doesn't have a lot of legacy depth and can move fast and so on. Or they were maybe like specific individual projects in a really large company, right? Like where it's like, okay, we have this new campaign we're going to launch. Let's build this with a new technology stack and we can go there, right? Like now that we're really starting to move into the early majority, we're talking very large companies, right? Like typical company in our pipeline now has more than 2,500 employees. They typically have a lot of complex systems, and a lot of them legacy systems, right? Like because that's a reality of operating a company over time, that you accumulate a lot of different systems. That means that when they start thinking about not like, let's build a new specific project here, but start thinking about moving some of their core properties over to a modern composable stack with like Jamstack for the front end, different well-defined APIs and services on the back end. That cannot be like, it's not a greenfield journey, right? Like they might be introducing Contentful or Sanity or even one of the traditional players' new headless products like Sitecore's headless cloud or something like that. And maybe they're introducing a headless commerce API as well, right? Like, but they're not getting rid of the fact that maybe they have some of these customers we talked to, maybe they have 2,000 Drupal installs sitting around as well, right? Like, and it's not just the installs in the data, like all of those have like employees and content editors trained in inputting content in this way, going to these UI, they have workflows built around them and so on, right? Like there's no realistic story for an architect in that situation of like, we're just going to migrate all the data to this new system, do a big transformation project and flip a switch, right? Like it's not going to work. So Valhalla is a lot about like, how do you put in a middleware layer that sits in between these front-end projects and your web teams and how they execute, and then this diverse systems of content and commerce sources behind them, and how do you get that in place in a way where you can slurp in the data, you can have it available, the front end teams can execute really fast, but you keep sort of your freedom to gradually maybe start replacing some of the Drupal installs with modern headless installs and so on, modernizing your architecture, moving to a real composable system in a way that's like gradual and sensible, rather than imagining that you can do some massive big replatforming, right? So in that way, it's a very different, like when we talk to those kind of customers, like to them, it's not about, are they using the new app? Like the architect there doesn't care, honestly, about the front end tools. Like, is it Next or is it Noxt, or is it like what they care about is like the architecture of the system and how they enable different teams to move independently and work together well, right? Like, so it's much more of an orchestration question.
No, brilliant. Jens, what is the value prop of WunderGraph? And we are running low on time, so Jens, give us the 30-second elevator pitch that you give to all the VCs that makes them go crazy.
So I think in a world of composable architecture, it's really important to make it super simple to connect multiple systems, get data from multiple systems, connect that to your front end. And that's what we call API dependency management, where you can have subsystems that bring the data you need. You add those APIs as dependencies to your front end. Well, in reality, you actually don't want to directly connect that to your front end, but you want to have some layer of security in the middle, some layer of integration. And that's what we call the BFF framework. And that's what we've created, the BFF-pattern.com website, for example, where we describe all these patterns. And I think React Server Components is an amazing tool to build something in the front end, but it's not really related to managing API dependencies of your applications or getting data from multiple systems in a manageable way.
Great answer. And then Matt, final question. Does Netlify CEO, angel invest?
Yeah, I do small angel investment, not like always very small checks, but more to stay connected with great founders and great companies, and be a little part of their journey and try to help them succeed.
Love that. Well, that concludes our WunderGraph AMA. Thank you again, Matt, so much for joining us. I think we might have to do a follow-up session, though, where we just talk about fundraising, because you were dropping straight bombs of knowledge out there and people were going crazy for it. So once again, thank you again so much for your time. Jens, as usual, thank you again for your time. And we will see everybody next week. Actually, it might be a holiday, but I'll keep you guys updated on Twitter. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was fun. Have a great one.
Ciao.
Keep up the great work.